By August 1944, no German division could stop Patton's tanks. In 26 days, his Third Army tore 600 kilometers across France, gas pedal pinned, Berlin practically in the windshield. Then came August 31st. The tanks didn't stop for the enemy. They stopped because the fuel trucks never came. At the Meuse River, crews siphoned gasoline from wrecked jeeps. Ahead, the Siegfried Line stood almost empty. Behind them, every drop of priority fuel had just been signed over to someone else's offensive. 4 months later, 50,000 Americans were dead, wounded, or missing in the Lorraine mud. The Germans didn't beat Patton, his own side did. Now, hold on to that number, 50,000, because the story of how that number was generated is not a story about strategy in the way most people imagine strategy. It is not a story about brilliant flanking maneuvers or about a stubborn enemy refusing to break. It is a story about cranes, about truck tires, about signatures on supply allocation sheets in a chateau in Versailles. It is a story in which a general who could move an entire army 400 miles in a month found himself, in September of 1944, unable to move it 40 more. By the end of August 1944, German resistance in Lorraine consisted of 9 infantry battalions, 2 artillery batteries, and 10 tanks. 10. The fortified Siegfried Line behind them was, in the words of the Germans themselves, almost completely unmanned. Patton's Third Army was 30 miles away, with 2 intact bridgeheads across the Meuse and a road network ahead of him that he had personally surveyed as a young officer in 1918. If you read the German records, you find their generals expecting the war to be lost in weeks. If you read the American records, you find Patton's intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, briefing him on the same conclusion. Every operational factor was screaming the same word: collapse. And yet, the war in the West did not end in 1944. It ended in May of 1945, after the Bulge, after the Rhine crossings, after another 250,000 American casualties on top of what had already been spent. The question is why? And the answer, when you trace it back, does not run through a German trench. It runs through a port that no longer had functional cranes. It runs through a fleet of 2.5-ton trucks running themselves into the ground at 60 miles per hour. And it runs through a single decision by a single supreme commander to give the priority fuel to someone else. This is the story of how an army was killed by its own logistics. Let me take you back to the beginning of August. Because to understand how everything collapsed, you first have to understand how breathtakingly well it was going. You have to feel the way the men in those tanks felt it, the sense that the war was almost over. On August 1st, 1944, the Third Army became operational. Patton had been on ice for almost a year, after the slapping incidents in Sicily had nearly ended his career. He had spent the spring as a decoy for Operation Fortitude, pretending to command a fictional army group in Kent that the Germans believed would land at Calais. Now, finally, he had real tanks under him again. And he was angry, and he was vindicated, and he was about to give the United States Army one of the most spectacular maneuvers in its history. The geography mattered. Operation Cobra had cracked the German line near St. Lo on July 25th. By the time the Third Army went live a week later, there was a hole in the German front the size of a small country. Patton poured through it. The classic image is a kind of cavalry sweep, and that is exactly what it was. He sent 8th Corps into Brittany to clear the Atlantic ports. He sent 15th Corps east toward the Seine. He sent 12th Corps and 20th Corps charging into central France, behind the collapsing German 7th Army. He did this not over weeks, but, in some cases, over days. On August 25th alone, one division, the 80th Infantry, covered 280 miles in a single move. That is not infantry pace, that is highway pace. They were not so much fighting as they were driving. The numbers will tell you what was happening. The 20th Corps liberated Le Mans, then Angers, then Chartres, in 5 days of pursuit, then Fontainebleau on the 23rd, then Melun and Montereau on the Seine, then Château-Thierry on the Marne by the 27th, then Reims 2 days later, then Verdun and a bridgehead over the Meuse by August 31st. In the south, 12th Corps did the same thing along a parallel axis, through Troyes, across the Marne, at Vitry-le-François, into Châlons, into Saint-Mihiel by the end of the month. The 4th Armoured Division, Patton's pride, Tiger Jack, Wood's outfit was moving so fast that German staff officers later admitted they could not draw a coherent line on their maps. There was no line. There were only American armored columns appearing in towns the Germans had thought were still safely in the rear. You have to understand what this looked like from the inside. In the diaries of Third Army officers from that month, you find a single emotional register repeated almost word for word. This is the breakthrough. This is the end. We are running them down. The intelligence picture supported it. Ultra decrypts, which Patton was being briefed on daily by Koch, showed German signals traffic in chaos. Whole divisions had ceased to exist as organized formations. The German 7th Army's commander reported that he had no idea where his own units were. On the western side of the front, the German 15th Army was still pinned around Calais, fooled into thinking another invasion was coming there. The Wehrmacht in France was, by any measure, defeated, and the men knew it. The men felt it. There is a particular kind of psychological state that comes over a victorious army at the moment it senses the enemy is breaking, and the Third Army in August of 1944 was living inside that state continuously for almost 4 weeks. They covered 400 miles, by some accounts, 600 kilometers. They paid almost nothing for it. They were going to be in Germany by Christmas. They were going to finish it. Now I want you to hold that image. The columns of dust on the French roads. The Sherman tanks with maps spread on their hulls. The infantry hitching rides on truck hoods because there was no time to walk. Hold it, because what I am about to describe is what was happening simultaneously several hundred miles behind them. And it is the real story. Because the supply situation that was carrying that army on its shoulders was already, in the first week of August, fundamentally broken. And nobody at the front knew yet. Here is the structural problem nobody had solved. The pre-invasion plan, drawn up by the SHAEF planners in 1943 and refined in early 1944, had assumed that after the Normandy breakout, Allied armies would advance at a measured pace and pause at the Seine to rebuild their logistical base before pushing into Germany. The plan called for the capture of Cherbourg as the principal supply port, supplemented by the Mulberry artificial harbors, with a network of fuel pipelines following the advance, and a rail network being repaired behind it. The estimates were that the front line would reach the Seine by D plus 90 days, that is to say, by early September. In reality, the Third Army reached the Seine by D plus 80 days, but it did not pause there. It kept going. By D plus 85 it was at the Marne. By D plus 90 it was at the Meuse, 300 miles beyond where SHAEF had assumed it would be. The supply base, meanwhile, had not moved at the same speed. It could not. The French rail network had been bombed to pieces by the Allies themselves in the months before D-Day, precisely to prevent the Germans from reinforcing Normandy. Now those same destroyed bridges and broken switchyards were strangling the supply convoys that had to follow the advance. The fuel pipelines had not been laid. They were still being built south from Cherbourg, lagging 200 miles behind the front. And Cherbourg itself was the deepest part of the problem. The Germans had not given up the port without breaking it. When American troops captured the city on June 27th, they found the harbor's cranes destroyed, the docks demolished, the channel mined, and almost every piece of cargo handling equipment systematically sabotaged. By the planning documents, Cherbourg was supposed to be handling 20,000 tons of supplies a day by mid-August. In reality, through August, it was struggling to move barely a quarter of that. The Mulberry Harbor at Omaha Beach had been wrecked by the June storm. Almost everything coming ashore in Normandy had to be unloaded from ships anchored offshore, ferried in by smaller craft, dragged across beaches, and stacked in dumps that the trucks then had to drive out to. This is where the Red Ball Express was born, and I want to talk about it carefully, because almost everything you have probably heard about the Red Ball Express is romanticized. The Red Ball Express began operations on August 25, 1944. It was a desperate, improvised solution to a problem that should never have existed. The planners had assumed the railways would handle the bulk of supply movement once the front got past Normandy. The railways were not ready, so instead, the army threw a fleet of trucks at the problem. By peak strength, it was operating around 6,000 vehicles, most of them the standard 2.5-ton GMC truck, the famous Deuce and a Half. 3/4 of the drivers were African-American soldiers from segregated quartermaster truck companies, men who, in the words of the Army's own later reports, were thrown into a job that almost nobody had been trained to do. They drove in two-man teams. They drove 24 hours a day. They drove with the engine governors disabled, sometimes pushing their trucks past 60 miles per hour on roads that had not been designed for that speed. At peak, they were moving 12,500 tons of supplies a day. That number sounds impressive until you compare it to demand. The American armies in France by the end of August needed somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 tons a day to sustain offensive operations. 12,000 was not enough, and every additional mile, the front advanced 8 further into the system's efficiency, because every additional mile meant more fuel consumed by the trucks themselves, more vehicle breakdown, more driver fatigue, more time on the road instead of unloading. By the second week of operation, the Red Ball Express was consuming, internally, almost 300,000 gallons of fuel a day just to deliver supplies to the front. The system was eating itself, and it was breaking down. Trucks were running their engines into ruin. Tires were dissolving on the rough French roads at a rate the spare parts supply could not match. Drivers were falling asleep at the wheel and going off the road. The Quartermaster Corps had to scour rear area units for any soldier with any kind of truck driving experience and press them into service, sometimes after 30 minutes of training. There are Quartermaster after-action reports from this period that read like industrial accident logs. The system was working only because it was being driven beyond its design limits by men who had no other option. The way I read the records, and I want to be honest with you about this, because the popular narrative about Patton's logistics being denied by jealous superiors is one of the most persistent myths in American military history, the system was not denying Patton fuel out of spite. The system was denying Patton fuel because the system was, in late August of 1944, already physically incapable of delivering the quantities his army needed. The denial was not political at that stage, it was mechanical. The trucks did not exist, the cranes did not exist, the pipelines did not exist. Patton had outrun his logistical tail in a way that no force in modern military history had managed to do, and the price for that outrunning was about to be charged. And here is the moment when the dream cracks. If you look at the Third Army's daily fuel receipts in August, you can watch the disaster build in slow motion, the way you watch a wave swell offshore before it breaks. The numbers come from the Army's own logistical histories. On August 12th, the Third Army received 396,000 gallons of gasoline. That was adequate. On August 19th, it received 367,000 gallons, still functional. On August 26th, and this is the number that should freeze you, the Third Army received 285 gallons, not 1,000, 285. That is not a logistics shortfall, that is an organ failure. That is the moment the body of an army stops getting blood. And it happened almost without warning at the front. General Hugh Gay, Patton's chief of staff, recorded in his diary that the headquarters staff was, in his words, dumbfounded when the seriousness of the situation became clear. They had been hearing logistical complaints from the rear all month, and, like most fighting men hearing from quartermasters, they had assumed the wolf was being cried. What made it worse was that the bridgehead at Verdun, which 20th Corps had seized on August 31st, was less than 200 miles from the Rhine, with almost nothing organized in between. 12th Corps had survived the previous days only because the 4th Armored Division had captured a German fuel depot at Chalons containing, by the after-action report, around 100,000 gallons of gasoline. The Third Army was, by this point, literally running on captured enemy fuel, and it was about to run out of even that. So Patton did what Patton always did. He pushed, he demanded. He sent his G4, Walter Muller, in person to plead at Bradley's headquarters. He ordered his tanks forward even with empty tanks, on the theory that if Eisenhower saw the spearheads moving, fuel would arrive to support them. He told Bradley, in a phrase recorded in multiple memoirs from the time, that he could go all the way to the Rhine if they gave him gasoline. He told his staff, on September 2nd, the line that has followed him through history, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." In my view, what makes this period so painful to read about, even 80 years later, is that Patton was, in a narrow operational sense, completely correct. The Germans in front of him really were that thin. Manteuffel and the staff officers of Army Group G would later acknowledge in their own memoirs that there was nothing organized between the Third Army and the Rhine in the first week of September, and that the Siegfried Line in the Saar sector was held by, in their own phrase, almost ghost units. The opportunity was real. Patton was not hallucinating it. The intelligence supported it. Ultra confirmed it. The captured German officers screamed it under interrogation. But, and here is where I have to push back against the Patton mythology, because the mythology is bad history, and bad history makes for bad lessons. The opportunity Patton saw and the opportunity that actually existed were not the same opportunity. The opportunity Patton saw was lunge to the Rhine before the Germans recover. The opportunity that actually existed, given what the Allied logistical system was actually capable of doing, was lunge to the Rhine, and then have a starving army sitting on the Rhine for 2 months with no ammunition, no winter clothing, no replacement vehicles, and exposed flanks. We forget this because Patton is a romantic figure, but the post-war analyses by the Army's own logisticians, Carter Magruder, Roland Rupenthal, others make clear that the supply system would have collapsed entirely if Patton had been given priority. The question was not whether the war could end in 1944, the question was which catastrophic gamble to accept. Eisenhower chose the northern gamble, and that is where the deadlock starts. Here is what happened in the first 10 days of September, set out as cleanly as I can, because the public version of this story is so encrusted with myth that the actual sequence has been almost lost. September 1st. Eisenhower formally took over ground command of the Allied armies, having previously left Montgomery as the temporary ground commander. September 4th, Eisenhower met with Montgomery in Brussels. Montgomery proposed what he called a single, full-blooded thrust through the northern Netherlands toward the Ruhr, with himself in command, and with the entire weight of Allied logistics behind him. Eisenhower rejected the single thrust but agreed to give the northern offensive priority. September 5th. The Third Army received another small fuel allocation, around 240,000 gallons, and Patton resumed limited advances toward the Moselle. September 10th, Eisenhower met with Montgomery again, this time at the Brussels airport, with Eisenhower remaining in his aircraft because of a leg injury. Montgomery had now refined his proposal into Operation Market Garden, an airborne and armored thrust through Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem, with the objective of crossing the lower Rhine and outflanking the Siegfried Line. Eisenhower approved it. The operation was scheduled for September 17th. The priority of fuel allocation went with it. September 17th, Market Garden began. By the official United States Army history, and I am citing Hugh Cole's Lorraine campaign volume here, the standard reference work, the critical gasoline shortage for the Third Army, had actually ended by September 10th. So, the popular story that Market Garden directly starved Patton at the Meuse is, strictly speaking, not quite right. The starvation had been in the last week of August and the first week of September. What Market Garden did was something subtler and, in some ways, worse. It locked in the priority. It meant that even after the immediate fuel crisis was resolved, the strategic momentum, the airborne assets, the truck companies on loan from the British, the resupply throughput from Cherbourg, and the new ports at Le Havre, all of that was committed northward. The Third Army was not going to get the surge it needed to break through. It was going to get just enough to keep advancing, in increments, against an enemy that was now being given exactly the time it needed to rebuild. And the Germans did rebuild. This is the part that breaks your heart if you read the records carefully. Because every day of the pause, the German command was doing exactly what the Wehrmacht had always been astonishingly good at, improvising defenses out of wreckage. The First Army under Otto von Knobelsdorff was reconstituted around the Moselle line. Volksgrenadier divisions, units thrown together from convalescents, Luftwaffe, ground staff, naval personnel, anyone with a pulse were rushed in to fill the gaps. The fortified zone around Metz, with its ring of 19th century forts that the Germans had spent decades reinforcing, was garrisoned by men who 2 weeks earlier had not existed as a formation. And the 5th Panzer Army, which Manteuffel was rebuilding around the new 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, was being readied for a counterattack. You can chart the death of the opportunity on a calendar. On September 1st, the Lorraine sector contained roughly 9 German infantry battalions and 10 tanks. By September 14th, when 12th Corps finally tried to force the Moselle in serious strength, the same sector contained 5 reconstituted infantry divisions, 2 panzer brigades, and the entire reorganized 5th Panzer Army moving up behind them. In 14 days, the German order of battle in Lorraine had multiplied by an order of magnitude. The window had not just closed, the window had been bricked over. This was the deadlock. This was the moment the meat grinder began to feed. I want to talk about what happened next in a way that is not just a list of battles, because if you only catalogue the place names, Arracourt, Gramercy Forest, Driant, Mézières, you miss what was actually happening, which is that an entire month of grinding attritional combat in mud and rain was being substituted for what could have been 3 weeks of clean operational maneuver. Every casualty in Lorraine from mid-September onward is, in a real sense, a casualty of the supply system that was not built. That is a strong claim. Let me make it concrete, in the only way that matters, with steel against steel. Between September 18th and September 29th, in the rolling farmland east of Nancy, the Third Army fought what most American armor officers consider the cleanest tactical victory of the entire Western Front. On paper, this should have been a German massacre. The Germans came on with the long-barreled 75mm KWK-42, the Panther's gun, a muzzle velocity of around 935 meters per second, capable of punching through the frontal armor of an M4 Sherman at 2,000 meters. The Panther's glacis plate, sloped at 55 degrees, 80 millimeters thick, was effectively impervious to the Sherman's stubby, short-barreled 75mm at any range beyond point blank. By the cold mathematics of armor and gun, a Sherman that engaged a Panther at distance was dead before it knew it was in a fight. The Americans came on with the M4, stubby gun, thinner armor, inferior optics, and one quality the Panther did not have, the ability to keep moving. Here is what the engineering trade-off actually meant on the ground. The Panther weighed 45 tons. Its final drive, the transmission component that delivered power to the tracks, was a known weak point. The Wehrmacht's own maintenance reports rated it as failure-prone after a few hundred kilometers of road march. Its fuel consumption was roughly twice the Sherman's. Its turret traverse, hydraulically powered, was slow. The Sherman weighed around 30 tons. Its turret traversed faster. Its tracks could turn on softer ground without throwing themselves. Its automotive reliability was, by any honest measure, 2 generations ahead of the German vehicle. Where a Panther broke down, an American crew sent in a recovery vehicle and welded it back to life by morning. Where a Sherman broke down, the factories at Lima and Detroit were already pushing a replacement onto a ship. The morning of September 19th came in thick fog over the Lorraine plateau. Visibility was measured in tens of meters. And in fog, the Panther's 2,000-meter killing reach was worth exactly nothing. The German tanks rolled forward blind, into terrain the Americans had already ranged. The Shermans engaged at 200 yards, 300 yards, sometimes from defilade positions at the crest of low ridges where the Panther's sloped glacis no longer mattered because the American gunners were shooting at the thinner side armor or the turret roof. American tank destroyers, the M18 Hellcat, with its 76mm gun, the M10 with its 3-inch moved into ambush positions at speed, the Panther could not match, killed, and displaced before German artillery could respond. For 11 days, in patchwork fog and rain, the battle ran in this same rhythm. A new German Panzer Brigade, fresh, on paper, formidable, equipped with the best tanks Germany was still producing in 1944, would roll forward, expecting the qualitative superiority of its main armament to carry the day. The Americans, with inferior weapons and superior tactics, would let the Germans commit, hit them in the flanks, kill the lead vehicles, force the column to bunch, and then call down artillery and fighter bombers when the weather lifted. By September 29th, when the German commitment to the counterattack finally exhausted itself, the German armored force in Lorraine had lost roughly 285 tanks. American losses were 48. The Wehrmacht had thrown away most of the replacement panzer production allocated to the entire Western Front that month, and had nothing to show for it. The Germans' own chief of staff in that sector, Friedrich von Mellenthin, later wrote that the west wall behind them was still essentially unmanned at the moment the battle ended, and that the Third Army could have driven through to the Rhine if it had been given a free hand. But the Third Army was not given a free hand. On September 25th, while this tank battle was still grinding through its final phase, Omar Bradley personally ordered the Third Army to assume the defensive. The logistical priority was still flowing north. The fuel was not coming. The replacements were not coming. The tactical victory could not be exploited. American crews who had just outfought the best armor the Reich could field were ordered to stop and dig in. In my view, this is one of the most underrated points of inflection in the entire Western European campaign, because the conventional history treats this battle as a curiosity, a footnote in the larger Lorraine slog. It was not a footnote. It was the proof of concept that the supposedly inferior American tank, in the hands of crews who understood what their machine could and could not do, could destroy German armor at a 4-to-1 ratio. And the system in which those crews operated had already decided, 2 weeks earlier, that it did not matter whether they could. In my view, this is one of the most underrated points of inflection in the entire Western European campaign, and one of the most painful. Because the conventional history treats Arracourt as a curiosity, a footnote in the larger Lorraine slog, it was not a footnote. It was the proof of concept that the Third Army could have done what Patton said it could do, and the system in which Patton operated had already decided, 2 weeks earlier, that it did not matter whether he could. The way I read the records, after September 25th, the campaign in Lorraine becomes, fundamentally, a different kind of war. It stops being a campaign of opportunity and starts being a campaign of exhaustion, and the exhaustion is bilateral. The Germans are exhausted because they are throwing every available reserve into a line they cannot truly hold. The Americans are exhausted because they are doing what infantry has always done when the maneuver options are gone. They are walking into fortified positions and getting killed. This brings us to Fort Driant. Fort Driant sits on a ridge about 5 miles southwest of Metz, on the west bank of the Moselle. It was originally built in 1902 and named after a French colonel. It is, in the technical military sense, a casemated artillery fortress. Its walls are steel-reinforced concrete. It is surrounded by a dry moat. It has armored gun batteries, machine gun cupolas, infantry trenches, ammunition magazines, and a complex of tunnels and bunkers below the surface that, in places, extends 60 feet underground. By 1944, it had been further improved by both French and German engineers across 2 world wars. It was, by any reasonable measurement, almost impossible to assault from the surface. Patton declared it an easy target. I want to read you the chronology, because it is, frankly, one of the bleakest pages in the operational history of the Third Army. On September 27, 1944, P-47 Thunderbolts of the 19th Tactical Air Command began bombing Fort Driant with 1,000-pound bombs and, by some accounts, napalm. The bombs did almost nothing. The fort's reinforced concrete was rated to absorb that level of ordnance. 240mm artillery was then brought to bear. Direct hits scored, but again, with little effect on the underground structure. At 14:15 hours that afternoon, elements of the 5th Infantry Division E Company, G Company supported by the 818th Tank Destroyer Company, began the ground assault. The Americans were not equipped to fight this kind of battle. They had no specialized assault engineers in the strength required. They had no flame tanks. They had no satchel charges in the quantities needed. They had infantrymen, basic combat engineers, and tank destroyers against a fortress that had been designed in 1902 specifically to defeat infantry attacks. For the next 16 days, the assault ground on. Small parties of American troops would get inside one of the surface works of the fort, only to find that the Germans had withdrawn into the tunnels beneath them. The Americans would then descend into the tunnels and fight in the dark, with grenades and pistols and bayonets against defenders who knew every corner of the underground complex. Casualties mounted. Replacements arrived green and were killed within hours. The morale of the 5th Infantry Division, one of the steadiest divisions in the Third Army, took a hammering it would not fully recover from. On the night of October 12th to 13th, the Americans were withdrawn from Fort Driant. The fort had not been taken. The 5th Infantry Division had sustained, by the official army count, 64 killed, 547 wounded, and 187 missing or presumed captured. 798 casualties. For a fort that, as Bradley himself reportedly said to Patton during the battle, could have been simply pinched out, taken from behind, once the Third Army was moving again. Bradley's question to Patton is on the record, in different versions across different memoirs, but the substance is consistent. Why are you bloodying your nose in this pecking campaign? Why are you attacking Fort Driant frontally when you could just bypass the entire Metz fortress complex once you have fuel for proper maneuver? Patton's answer is also on the record. He said, "We are using Metz to blood the new divisions, to get the inexperienced replacement troops their first taste of combat." 2. In a phrase that recurs in his diaries, "Keep the army from going stale." I want to pause here, because this is the moment in the campaign where I have to be the most careful and the most honest. Patton's defenders, then and now, argue that with no fuel for maneuver, he had no operational alternative, that aggressive, limited attacks were necessary to prevent atrophy in his command. There is something to that argument. An army that sits still for weeks in mud begins to disintegrate as an organism. But the way I read the records, the Fort Driant decision was not a cold operational choice. It was the choice of a commander who could not psychologically accept his own paralysis, and who was looking for somewhere, anywhere, to channel the kinetic energy of a force he could no longer move freely. The men who died on Fort Driant's casemates between September 27th and October 13th paid the price for a logistical decision made in Brussels, for a strategic posture they did not choose, and for a command philosophy that valued movement, even pointless movement, over preservation. Let me be very clear about what I am criticizing here. I am not criticizing the American soldier, who in this campaign fought with extraordinary tenacity and improvisation under conditions almost no veteran of the August pursuit had imagined possible. I am criticizing a sequence of operational and logistical decisions made at multiple echelons by men who, in many other contexts, displayed the highest competence. The system failed. The system failed because it had been asked to do something the planners had never quite expected, and because, when the strategic pivot point arrived in early September, it was resolved through compromise rather than through commitment. And now I have to slow down, because I want to take you through what the rest of October and November looked like, in pieces, in the way the men in the field experienced it. Because this is the avalanche stage of the story, and it is the stage that the popular narrative most often forgets. October 3rd. The 90th Infantry Division begins assaulting the northern suburb of Mézières-les-Metz. The fighting is house to house, cellar to cellar. Each house has to be reduced individually with grenades and small arms. A single house can cost a platoon. The advance is measured in city blocks per week. October 10th. The autumn rains in Lorraine intensify. The official army weather records show rainfall in November will reach 6.95 inches, between 2 and 3 times the regional average. The Lorraine clay soil saturates and turns to a viscous glue-like mud that immobilizes tracked vehicles and reduces infantry movement to a crawl. Boots fall apart. Trench foot becomes an epidemic. The 26th Infantry Division would later record more casualties to weather than to enemy action during certain weeks of this campaign. October 14th. Replacement ammunition for the Third Army's 105mm howitzers begins to be rationed. Crews are told to engage only confirmed targets. The Army's official history would later record that while the fuel shortage was eventually remedied, the ammunition shortage in Lorraine was never fully resolved before the end of the campaign. October 27th. Patton begins planning a renewed offensive against the Metz fortifications, this time with substantially reinforced engineer assets. The new attack will not begin until November 8th, delayed repeatedly by weather and supply. November 8th. The Lorraine offensive resumes in pouring rain. Air support is grounded. Artillery is firing on rationed allocations. Infantry divisions are wading through mud halfway up the calves of the assault troops. The 12th Corps and 20th Corps grind forward, division by division, town by town. November 14th. Patton, Wood, Bradley, Eddy, and Leven Allen meet at a forward headquarters near Metz, studying maps. The photograph survives. The senior commanders' faces are tired in a way that the August faces are not. November 22nd. Metz falls to the 5th Infantry Division. It is the first time the city has been directly stormed since 1552. The remaining forts around the city will hold out until December 13th. By the time the Third Army stops being able to push, on December 18th, when the bulge begins and Patton is ordered to wheel his entire army 90 degrees north to relieve Bastogne, the Lorraine campaign casualty list reads as follows: 6,657 Americans killed in action, 36,406 wounded, 12,119 missing, 55,182 total combat casualties. In the air, in the rain, in the cellars of Mézières, in the tunnels of Driant, in the Panzer Grenadier counterattacks at Grémassy, in the mud, everywhere. In my view, when you set those casualties next to the operational situation as it stood on September 1st, 9 German battalions, 10 tanks, an unmanned Siegfried Line, you have one of the most expensive logistical failures in the history of the American Army. Not because the soldiers failed, not because the commanders, in some narrow personal sense, failed, but because the entire industrial pipeline behind them, from the cranes at Cherbourg to the rail repair crews in Normandy to the truck companies of the Red Ball Express, was not equal to the speed of the army it was supposed to feed. And there is a temptation, when reading this campaign, to look for villains, to blame Eisenhower for the broad front strategy, to blame Montgomery for Market Garden, to blame Bradley for the Driant decision, to blame Patton for the Driant assault. These are all conversations historians have been having for 80 years, and they are conversations worth having, but the way I read the records, the deepest answer is something more uncomfortable. The deepest answer is that the United States Army, in 1944, had built a force whose tactical capabilities had outrun its strategic logistics. The Third Army in August was a Ferrari with a fuel tank designed for a Model T. The breakthrough was so successful, so beyond what the planners had imagined possible, that the supply system was structurally unable to support it. And when that supply system cracked, the cracking was permanent. You could not regenerate the operational opportunity. The Germans were not going to be that thin again until April of 1945. You got one window. You missed the window because the trucks weren't ready, because the port cranes were broken, because the pipelines were 200 miles behind schedule, because the rails had been bombed by your own Air Force a year earlier. The window closed, and then you paid in blood for the next 8 months. So let me leave you with a question, because this is, finally, a campaign that should make every modern military planner uncomfortable and every honest reader of history a little quieter. If 3 more functional cranes at Cherbourg in July of 1944, 3 more pieces of port handling equipment, not divisions, not tanks, not airborne assaults, if 3 more cranes could have raised Cherbourg's tonnage by even 5,000 tons a day in August, would Patton have had the gasoline to keep his tanks moving past the Meuse on September 1st? Would the Lorraine campaign as we know it have ever happened? Would the 50,000 American casualties in Lorraine, the 15,000 more on the Hurtgen forest line that fall, the 100,000 at the Bulge that winter, would any of those numbers be different? These are not unanswerable questions. They are exactly the kind of question the Army's own logistical historians spent the late 1940s asking themselves in volumes that almost nobody outside professional military education ever reads. Roland Ruppenthal wrote 2,000 pages on this question. Carter Magruder wrote his own analysis. The Lorraine Campaign volume by Hugh Cole, published by the Center of Military History in 1950, is in many ways an extended meditation on exactly the cost of what the planners did not build. I want you to think about this, because the lesson, and there is a lesson, even if it is an unromantic one, is that wars in the industrial age are not finally won by men like Patton, however brilliant. They are won by the men who solve the problem of how to put 30,000 tons of supplies on a beach every day. They are won by the engineers who repair the bridges, and the longshoremen who unload the ships, and the African-American truck drivers of the quartermaster companies who ran their engines into ruin on the roads from Cherbourg to Chalons. They are won, in the end, by the dullest and least glamorous part of any army. We tell the story of Patton because Patton is the kind of figure who makes a story. The dust on the tanks, the drive across France, the pearl-handled revolvers, the pronouncements. But the actual decision about whether the war ends in 1944 or 1945 was made not by Patton and not by Eisenhower and not by Montgomery. It was made by the cranes at Cherbourg, by the bombed-out rail switchyards near Lisieux, by the worn-out clutches of the Red Bull trucks. It was made by an industrial system that had been built for a slower war than the one its army was suddenly fighting. That is the unromantic truth of August and September 1944. The most aggressive ground commander the United States produced in the war, leading the most successful armored pursuit in American history against a defeated and disorganized enemy, with the door to Germany standing open in front of him, was stopped, finally, and decisively, by his own side's lack of ability to deliver gasoline. He stood at the Meuse on August 31st, 1944, and the door was open. By the time anyone could give him the fuel to walk through it, the door had been closed, bricked up, and reinforced. The Germans did not close the door, the Allies did, and then they spent the next 4 months and the next 50,000 casualties trying to break the door back down. I would like to know what you think. Was Patton, in that first week of September, really the man who could have ended the war? Or is the myth itself part of the problem, a story we tell ourselves because it lets us imagine that wars turn on individual greatness, when the records keep pointing back, again and again, to fuel allocations and crane manifests, and the prosaic mathematics of tons per mile per day? Tell me, in the comments, what you make of the records. I will read them. This is the part of the story that does not end. The Lorraine campaign closed officially on December 18th, 1944, when the Third Army turned 90 degrees north and went to break the German offensive in the Ardennes. Within 4 days, Patton's lead elements were inside the perimeter at Bastogne. Within 4 months, he was across the Rhine and into central Germany. Within 7 months, the war in Europe was over, but the Lorraine dead are still where they fell. The American military cemetery at Saint-Avold holds 10,489 of them. It is the largest American World War II cemetery in Europe. Walk through it sometime. The headstones are dated from September to December of 1944. Most of them are young men, the median age in the 20s. Most of them died within 40 miles of the Meuse River. They died not at the moment of the breakthrough, but at the moment after the breakthrough, when the spear had gone too far ahead of the shaft, and the shaft could not catch up. That is the war the cranes did not lift. That is the gasoline that did not arrive. That is the price, in human cost, of a supply chain that almost made it. The men who paid that price never saw the inside of a SHAEF planning room, never read a logistics report, never knew what the daily tonnage at Cherbourg was. They only knew that the trucks did not come, and then the orders came to attack anyway. 80 years later, the records are still there. The logistics histories, the decision documents, the daily tonnage manifests at Cherbourg. None of it is classified. None of it is hidden. You can buy the volumes used for under $50, and they tell, in measured and unromantic prose, a story that the popular memory of the Western Front still has not entirely absorbed. The story is this. In August of 1944, the United States Army built one of the greatest pursuit operations in modern history. And then, 3 weeks later, that operation died because the Army's own supply system could not keep up with it. The men who paid for that gap between what the spearhead could reach and what the rear could deliver were the infantrymen of the 5th Division, and the 26th, and the 80th, and the 90th, and the tankers of the 4th Armored, and the engineers, and the medics, and the African-American truck drivers who ran themselves into exhaustion on roads that did not stop demanding more. Patton did not lose Lorraine. The Germans did not win Lorraine. Lorraine was the bill, paid in American blood, for the distance between what the army at the front could do and what the army at the rear could deliver. Read that sentence again, if you need to, because we are going to keep fighting wars in which the industrial base behind the spearhead matters more than the spearhead itself. Patton's tanks ran dry at the Meuse on August 31st, 1944. The bill came due in the mud of Lorraine. It is still being paid in the silence of Saint-Avold. I will see you in the next one.